She saw how they avoided looking back, how they pulled their coats tighter around their bodies as they turned away from the grave, as if the cold came from the twins themselves rather than from the gray sky pressing down on the mountain like a hand trying to smother something still breathing. Serene began to cry. She cried the way she always cried, quietly, carefully, as if her tears might disturb someone, as if even her grief needed permission to exist. Ilara put an arm around her sister and held her while the gravediggers worked. While the last of the town's people disappeared down the mountain road without a single word of comfort. While the snow thickened and the light dimmed, and the grave became a mound of frozen earth, indistinguishable from all the others in the small cemetery where their mother already lay. Then Ilara turned her sister toward home, and they began the long walk back. Stormer followed 10 paces behind. The old wolf dog moved with the careful deliberation of an animal who had learned to conserve what little strength remained. His silver-gray fur was dusted with snow. His muzzle had gone completely white years ago, but his eyes, ancient, amber, impossibly knowing, watched the 2 young women with a patience that seemed to belong to something older than any single lifetime. He had been their father's dog. Before that, their grandfather's. 12 years of mountain winters lived in those bones. 12 years of loyalty that never once wavered. A trapper who had known their grandfather had given the pup to Henrik, saying the animal carried the spirit of high places in its blood. Their father had kept Stormer out of respect for the old ways, even though he had long since stopped believing in them. Now the old wolf dog was all that remained of those old ways. Him, and whatever secrets still hid inside the cabin that appeared through the trees like a wound in the forest. Even from a distance, Ilara could see the problems. The roof sagged on the eastern side where years of accumulated snow had pressed beyond the timber's ability to bear. Gaps showed between the logs where the chinking had cracked and fallen away like dead skin. The chimney tilted slightly, evidence of a slow collapse that had been happening for years while everyone pretended not to notice. This was the house their father had built when he first came to these mountains from somewhere far away, bringing a young bride and dreams of silver wealth that never materialized. Henrik had been a farmer, not a carpenter. He had swung a hammer the way a farmer swings a hammer, with more force than precision, more hope than skill. The walls he raised were thick but poorly fitted. The joints he cut were strong but graceless. He had done his best. His best had not been good enough. The wind found every weakness in that cabin. It crept through the gaps and whistled under the door, and turned every winter night into a negotiation with cold that could never quite be won. Their mother had fought that cold for 19 years. She had stuffed rags into the cracks and hung quilts over the windows and kept the fire burning through nights so long they seemed to have no end. But it was never enough. The cold was patient. The cold had time. In the end, the cold had won. Ilara pushed open the door and stepped inside. Her breath still formed small clouds that drifted in the still air. The water bucket beside the stove wore a thin skin of ice across its surface, proof that even with a fire burning, this house could not keep winter on the other side of the walls where it belonged. She knelt by the stove and began feeding it wood. The flames caught and grew, but she knew from years of bitter experience that it would take hours before the cabin felt anything close to comfortable. And by midnight, when the fire burned low, the cold would creep back in again, reclaiming every inch of warmth as if it had only been on loan. Serene sat on the edge of their parents' bed. She had not spoken since the funeral. Her face was pale. Her eyes were swollen. Her hands were folded in her lap like a woman 3 times her age who had already made peace with the idea that the world would never stop taking things from her. Ilara looked at her twin and felt something crack inside her chest. They were the same age, born on the same day, within the same hour, but they had never been the same. Ilara was taller by 2 inches, broader in the shoulders, stronger in the arms. She had inherited their father's stubborn jaw and their grandfather's sharp eyes. She was the one who split wood and hauled water and made decisions when decisions needed to be made. Serene was smaller, softer, more delicate in the way that certain wildflowers are delicate. Not weak, but built for a different kind of survival. She had their mother's gentle face and their grandmother's artist hands. She was the one who sewed and cooked and drew intricate pictures in the margins of books, creating small worlds of beauty in the middle of hardship that had no room for beauty. They complemented each other. They always had. But complementing each other and surviving a mountain winter alone were 2 very different things. And everyone in town had already decided which one the twins were capable of. 2 young women could not survive alone on a mountain homestead. Everyone said so. It was simply the way of things, as certain as gravity, as final as the frozen ground that now held both their parents. At the door, Stormer waited. He stood motionless on the threshold, snow melting from his fur, his ancient eyes moving between the 2 sisters as if he were measuring something only he could see. Then he crossed the cold floor and lay down at Saren's feet. He rested his grizzled head on his paws and did not move, offering the only comfort he knew how to give. The knock came 2 days later. Ilara opened the door to find Silas Drummond standing on the porch. His expensive coat was dusted with fresh snow. A silver watch chain gleamed against his dark vest, like a declaration of everything he owned and everything they did not. He was 54 years old, the owner of the largest mine in the region, and the richest man within 50 miles in any direction. He had not attended the funeral, but he had come now. Ilara stepped aside to let him enter, though every instinct in her body told her to close the door in his face. Drummond was not a man people refused. His mine employed half the men in town. His money had built the church, the school, the general store. When Silas Drummond wanted something, Silas Drummond usually got it, and Ilara was beginning to understand what he wanted. Drummond surveyed the cabin with eyes that missed nothing. She knew what he saw: the gaps in the walls, the frost on the windows, the pathetic fire struggling against impossible cold. He saw weakness. He saw opportunity. He saw prey. "I came to pay my respects," he said, his voice smooth as polished silver, "and to discuss practical matters." Seren rose from the bed and moved to stand beside her sister. Together, the twins faced the man who had come to pick over what remained of their family. "What practical matters?" Ilara asked. Drummond smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had already calculated the outcome and was simply waiting for everyone else to arrive at the number he had reached long ago. "This land," he said, "this cabin. 2 young women cannot maintain a homestead alone. It is not the natural order of things." He paused, letting the words settle. "I am prepared to make a fair offer, enough to relocate, perhaps to a city, enough to start fresh, somewhere more suitable for ladies of your situation." "Our situation?" Ilara repeated. "Orphaned, unmarried, without male protection." Drummond spread his hands as if these facts were self-evident and inarguable, like weather or geography. "The winter alone will be difficult enough," he continued, "and the winters here are not kind to the unprepared." Seren's hand found Ilara's. The younger twins' fingers were cold and trembling slightly, and Ilara held them the way she had held them since they were children. Firmly, protectively, as if she could keep the whole world from hurting her sister through the simple pressure of her grip. "We will manage," Ilara said. Something flickered across Drummond's face, just for a moment. Something harder than the polished concern he wore like cologne. Something cold and calculating and entirely without mercy. "I would hate to see 2 young women suffer needlessly," he said. "The offer stands. For now." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. "I should mention, I have been speaking with the judge about the legal status of this property. 2 women without male guardianship attempting to hold land?" He shook his head with theatrical sadness. "There are questions, complications. It would be so much simpler if you simply accepted my generous offer." He left without waiting for a response. Ilara stood at the window, watching his dark figure disappear into the snow. Beside her, Seren finally spoke. "He wants to take everything," she whispered. "Yes. Can he?" Ilara did not answer. She did not know, but she was beginning to suspect that Silas Drummond had reasons for wanting their land that went far beyond simple greed. That night, after Seren had cried herself to sleep, Ilara sat alone by the dying fire with Stormer at her feet and listened to the wind test the walls of the cabin. Every gust found a new gap, a new crack, a new failure in the structure her father had raised with such hopeful hands. She pulled a blanket tighter around her shoulders and watched her breath form small ghosts in the air. She thought about what Drummond had said, the legal status of the property, the judge, the complications. She did not know enough about law to understand exactly what he was threatening, but she understood the shape of it, the way you can understand the shape of a predator in the dark without seeing its teeth. And she thought about her father. Henrik had been a proud man, too proud, perhaps. He had come to these mountains with dreams of silver wealth, but the silver had eluded him. He had worked in other men's mines, including Drummond's, saving money year by year, always believing that someday he would strike his own fortune on his own land. He never did. But he had kept one thing from his own father. One thing he had never sold, never traded, never mentioned to anyone outside the family. Ilara rose from her chair and crossed to the corner of the cabin where her father's tool chest sat. It was a heavy oak box, scarred by decades of use, brought across an ocean by her grandfather before she was born. She had not opened it since her father's death. She had not been able to bear it. Now she knelt before it and lifted the lid. The smell of oil and sawdust rose to meet her like a greeting from the dead. Her father's tools lay neatly arranged, each in its place: hammers, chisels, planes, saws, the implements of a craftsman, though her father had never quite mastered the craft. But beneath the tools, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was something else entirely. Ilara lifted it carefully. The oilcloth fell away, revealing a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked with age, its pages had yellowed, but it was intact. Her grandfather's journal. She had seen it only once before, when she was 9 years old. Old Leaf had shown it to her, turning the pages slowly, explaining the drawings in his rough, accented English. She remembered his voice more than his words, low and certain, the voice of a man who knew things that most people had forgotten or never learned. "In the old country," he had said, "we do not build houses on the mountain. We build houses in the mountain. The earth stays the same temperature, summer and winter, always the same. The mountain protects." She had not understood then. She had been 9, more interested in playing than in listening to an old man talk about the country he had left behind. She had nodded and smiled and promptly forgotten everything he said. But now, sitting in a cabin that could not keep her warm, facing a winter that might kill her, knowing that the man who wanted her land would use every tool at his disposal to take it, she opened the journal and began to read. The drawings took her breath away. Page after page of careful sketches filled the yellowed paper. Houses built into hillsides, homes nestled in natural caves, dwellings that use the earth itself as insulation against killing cold. Her grandfather had studied these techniques for decades, had refined them, had dreamed of building one himself in this new country. And then she turned to a page that made her heart stop beating. It was a map, rough but detailed. Unmistakably, it showed the land around their homestead. Her grandfather had walked this ground with a builder's eyes, had surveyed it, searching for possibilities that others could not see. A small X marked a spot perhaps 2 miles up the mountain, behind a massive granite boulder that Ilara recognized from her childhood explorations. Beside the X, in her grandfather's careful handwriting, were words she had to read 3 times before she believed them. Perfect shelter. When you need it, it will be there. Her hands trembled as she turned the page. More drawings appeared. A cave entrance, wide and tall, facing southeast to catch the morning sun. Measurements. Notes about the angle of the opening, the depth of the chamber beyond. And then, a final drawing that made everything clear. A house built inside the cave. Wooden walls closing off the entrance to create rooms. A stone fireplace positioned against the cave wall, using a natural gap in the rock as a chimney. A sleeping loft where the ceiling rose highest. Windows set into the wooden front wall to let in light. Every detail, every measurement, everything needed to turn a natural cave into a home that the mountain itself would protect from winter's worst fury. He had designed it all. and he had never built it. Ilara flipped back through the journal, searching for an explanation. She found it in an entry written in a shaky hand, the handwriting of a man whose strength was failing, but whose mind remained sharp. Henrik refuses to listen. He says the old ways are for peasants, that Americans build proper houses above ground, like civilized people. He is ashamed of where we came from. He does not understand that the old ways survive because they work. I have shown him the cave. I have explained everything. He laughed at me. The entry continued below, written perhaps years later, the letters smaller and more cramped. If my son will not build what I have designed, perhaps my grandchildren will. I leave this journal for whoever needs it. The cave is there. The knowledge is here. When the time comes, someone will understand. Ilara closed the journal and held it against her chest. Her father had known. He had known there was a better way, a safer way, a way to survive winters that killed people in their poorly built cabins. And he had rejected it, out of pride, out of shame for his immigrant roots, out of a desperate need to prove that he had left the old country behind forever. And now he lay in frozen ground, buried beside the wife who died in the house he had insisted on building instead of the one his father had designed. But the cave was still there. The knowledge was still here. And Ilara finally understood what her grandfather had been trying to tell her all those years ago. She tucked the journal inside her coat. She looked toward the bed where Serene slept, her sister's face peaceful for once, free for a few hours from grief and fear and the crushing weight of a future that seemed to hold nothing but loss. Tomorrow, she would tell Serene everything. But first, she needed to find the cave herself. She needed to know if her grandfather's dreams were real or just the fantasies of an old man who never stopped longing for the place he had left behind. She left before dawn. The snow had stopped overnight, leaving the world wrapped in white silence so complete it felt sacred, as if the mountain were holding its breath. Stormer was waiting at the door. The old wolf dog rose stiffly from his spot on the cold floor, his ancient eyes bright with something that looked almost like anticipation. He knew she was going somewhere that mattered. He could sense it, the way animals sense things that exist beyond the reach of human understanding. "You should stay," Ilara told him. "Rest by the fire." Stormer ignored her completely. He walked through the open door and stood in the snow, waiting for her to follow. They climbed together. The map led them up through pine forests heavy with new snow, past frozen streams that whispered beneath their ice, past rocky outcroppings that thrust up from the white landscape like the bones of something ancient and enormous. The morning light came through the trees at a low angle, turning the snow into a field of scattered diamonds that would have been beautiful if beauty were something Ilara had time to notice. Twice she lost her way and had to backtrack, comparing the landmarks around her to the drawings in the journal. The snow was deep, sometimes past her knees, and her legs ached with every step. Her lungs burned from the cold air. Her fingers grew numb inside her mittens. But she kept going. Stormer ranged ahead, his old legs finding strength she had not expected. Despite his age, he moved through the snow with a surprising grace, pausing occasionally to look back and make sure she was still following. He seemed to know where they were going, seemed to remember trails he had walked long ago with a different master. 2 hours after leaving the cabin, Ilara rounded a massive granite boulder and stopped. The cave was exactly as her grandfather had drawn it. The entrance was perhaps 20 feet wide and 12 feet tall, a dark mouth in the mountainside facing southeast to catch the morning sun. A natural overhang of rock extended above the opening, protecting it from snow and rain. The floor inside was flat, covered in centuries of accumulated dust, but completely dry. Ilara walked inside. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Outside, the air was cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Inside the cave, 20 feet from the entrance, the air was cool but not cold. There was no wind, no dampness, just a stable, constant stillness that felt like the mountain breathing. She walked deeper. 30 feet, 40, 50. The light from the entrance dimmed to a soft gray glow, but the temperature remained exactly the same. She pressed her palm against the stone wall. It was not warm exactly, but it was not cold either. It was neutral, stable, unchanging. The mountain did not care about the killing cold that waited outside. The mountain maintained its own temperature, steady and unwavering. A refuge that had existed for thousands of years, waiting for someone who understood what it offered. Ilara turned to look back toward the entrance, where gray daylight filtered in, and Stormer sat watching her with patient attention. And she could see it, could see exactly what her grandfather had envisioned. A wooden wall across the front, with a door and windows. A floor of planks raised above the stone. A fireplace built against the side wall where a natural fissure rose toward the surface. A sleeping loft where the ceiling was highest. A home protected by the mountain itself. She could build this. No, they could build this. Together. The next morning, Ilara showed Seren the journal. She spread it open on the table, turning the pages slowly, explaining each drawing the way their grandfather had once explained them to her. She described the cave, the constant temperature, the natural features that made it perfect for the design Old Leaf had spent his life refining. Seren listened in silence. Her face was unreadable. When Ilara finished, the younger twin did not respond for a long moment. She stared at the drawings, at the measurements, at the notes written in a language she could barely read. "You want us to live in a cave?" she said finally. "Like animals." "I want us to live," Ilara replied. "This cabin is going to kill us. The same way it killed Mother. Drummond knows it. Everyone in town knows it. They are all waiting for us to freeze or starve or simply give up. And your solution is to become cave dwellers," Seren's voice cracked. "Do you have any idea what people already say about us? The cursed twins, the unlucky ones, the girls who brought misfortune to everyone around them. Now you want to give them more reasons to mock us?" "I do not care what they say." "Well, I care." Seren stood abruptly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I care because I have spent my entire life being whispered about, being avoided, being treated like something is wrong with me just because I happen to be born at the same time as you." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the fire. "I cannot take any more of it, Ilara. I cannot." The words landed like physical blows, but Ilara did not back down. She could not afford to. "Then go," she said quietly. "Take whatever money Drummond offers. Find a position somewhere as a seamstress or a servant. Spend the rest of your life working for people who will never see you as their equal." She paused. "Or stay here with me. Help me build what our grandfather designed. Prove that we do not need anyone's permission or approval to survive." Seren stared at her sister. The fire crackled in the silence between them. "And if the cave is not what you think," Seren whispered, "if grandfather's drawings are just the dreams of a homesick old man, then we sell the land and go together. Give me 1 week. Let me show you the cave. If it is not everything the journal describes, I will admit I was wrong." The silence stretched between them, filled with 19 years of shared history, shared struggle, shared love that went deeper than any disagreement could reach. "1 week," Seren said finally. "Show me your cave." The next morning, both sisters climbed the mountain together. Stormer led the way, his old legs more certain now that he knew the path. Seren struggled with the deep snow and the steep grade, but she did not complain. She did not speak at all until they rounded the granite boulder and the cave entrance appeared before them. Then she stopped. Ilara watched her sister's face carefully, looking for any sign of what she was thinking. Seren's expression shifted through several emotions. Surprise first, then skepticism, then something that might have been the earliest, most tentative beginning of wonder. Seren walked to the entrance and stood there for a long moment, looking at the stone walls, the high ceiling, the smooth floor stretching back into cool darkness. Then she stepped inside. She walked deeper than Ilara had gone the day before. She pressed her palms against the stone walls. She looked up at the ceiling, studying the natural formations, the fissures and gaps that their grandfather had noted in his drawings with such precision. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. The fear was still there, but something else had joined it. Something that sounded like the first breath drawn after nearly drowning. "It really is warm in here," she said. "The same temperature, summer and winter. That is what grandfather wrote. That is what the stone holds." Seren was quiet for another long moment. Then she pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket, the one she always carried for sketching, and began to draw. Ilara watched in surprise as her sister's pencil moved rapidly across the page. Lines appeared, walls, angles, proportions. Seren was not just looking at the cave. She was seeing it the way their grandfather had seen it, understanding the possibilities that the space contained. "If we build the front wall here," Seren said, still drawing, "we can maximize the interior space while keeping the proportions right. The fireplace should go against this wall where the chimney gap is widest. The sleeping loft needs to be high enough to stand beneath, which means we position it here, where the natural ceiling is tallest." She looked up at Ilara, and for the first time since their parents died, something like light showed in her eyes. "I can design this," she said. "I can design all of it. The layout, the proportions, the flow of the space." She met her sister's gaze with a steadiness that had not been there an hour ago. "You do the building. I do the design. We do it together, as equals." Ilara felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. She blinked them away before Serin could see. Together, she agreed, as equals. This was the moment everything truly changed. Not because they had found the cave, not because they had decided to build, but because they had found each other again. Two halves of something that worked only when both pieces were in place. The cursed twins. The unlucky ones. The girls everyone expected to fail. They had something the whole valley had underestimated. Each other. And somewhere deep in the mountain, the stone held its ancient warmth and waited. The way it had waited for Old Leaf. The way it had waited for Henrik, who never came. The way it had been waiting, all along, for the two young women who would finally understand what it offered. The mountain was patient. The mountain had time. And now, at last, someone was ready to listen to what it had been saying all along. The news reached town within a week. The Halverson twins had announced their intention to build a house inside a cave. Not move into the cave like animals. Actually construct a proper dwelling within it, using techniques their grandfather had designed decades ago in a journal no one had ever seen. The reaction was immediate, widespread, and exactly what Ilara had expected. At the general store, people gathered in small groups to discuss the scandal over coffee and purchases, their voices carrying with the particular clarity that belongs to people who believe they are speaking truth rather than gossip. Those poor, deluded girls, they said, building a house in a cave like something from the ancient world. Someone should really stop them before they hurt themselves. Reverend Harlan delivered a sermon the following morning about the dangers of rejecting civilized ways. He spoke of cave dwellers and people who had turned their backs on progress and enlightenment. He did not mention the Halverson sisters by name. He did not need to. Every person sitting in those pews knew exactly who he meant, and the whispers that followed the congregation out the church doors were louder than anything he had said from the pulpit. At the saloon, young men gathered to place bets on how long the twins would last. Virgil, a loud-voiced 23-year-old who worked at the general store and had never in his life built anything more complicated than an opinion, wagered $20 that the sisters would abandon their foolish project before summer arrived. Others matched his bet or raised it, laughing the easy laughter of people who have never been desperate enough to try something that everyone says is impossible. But no one tried to stop them, and no one offered to help. Through the cold weeks that followed, Ilara and Serin cut trees on their own land. Douglas fir mostly, the straight, tall pines that grew thick on the mountainside above the cave. Ilara had learned to use an axe from her father in the years before his death. The technique was simple. The execution was brutal. She taught Serin. They worked in tandem the way they did everything now. Ilara swinging while Serin rested, then Serin swinging while Ilara caught her breath. Back and forth for hours until the tree groaned and cracked and crashed to the snow-covered ground with a sound like the earth breaking a bone. Then they would trim the branches, cut the trunk into manageable lengths, and drag the logs down to the cave using ropes and determination and muscles that grew stronger with each passing week. Ilara's hands blistered. The blisters broke and bled and eventually hardened into calluses. Then the calluses split and blistered again beneath the toughened skin, creating layers of damage that never fully healed before new damage was added on top. Her shoulders ached constantly. She fell asleep each night the moment she lay down, and woke each morning feeling as if she had not rested at all. But the pile of lumber grew, and in town, the mockery grew with it. Then, on a gray morning in late winter, a wagon appeared on the trail leading up to the cave. Ilara set down her axe and watched it approach with careful eyes. The wagon was heavily loaded with lumber, good lumber, already cut and planed and ready for use. And the woman driving it was someone Ilara recognized but had never spoken to directly. Dagny Steenval. She was 45 years old, a widow. Her husband had died in a collapse at Drummond's mine, the same kind of accident that had taken other men over the years. Accidents that were never properly investigated. Questions that were never satisfactorily answered. Dagny had been living alone since then, surviving in a cabin not much better than the one the twins had abandoned. She pulled the wagon to a stop near the cave entrance and climbed down with the easy grace of a woman who had spent her entire life doing physical work. She was tall and strong, with gray-streaked blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, and hands that showed decades of hard labor in every line and scar. "I did not come to help for free," she said, without preamble or greeting. "I came to learn." Ilara studied her. Learn what? How to build something that will not kill me. Dagny's eyes were steady and unwavering, filled with a grief that had long since hardened into something more useful than sadness, something closer to purpose. "My husband died because Drummond refused to shore up the mine tunnels properly. He cut corners to save money, and men died for his greed. My husband died." She paused, and the pause was not dramatic. It was simply the space a person needs when they are saying something that still costs them to say. "I have been living in a cabin not much better than yours, cold in winter, falling apart more with every passing season. When I heard what you were doing up here, building into the mountain the way our people did in the old country, I wanted to see for myself." She looked past Ilara to the cave entrance, to the walls that were just beginning to take shape inside. "Your grandfather knew things," she continued, "things that people in this valley have forgotten or never learned. I want to know those things too." Seren emerged from the cave, sketchpad in hand, and stood beside her sister. The twins exchanged a glance, the silent communication they had developed over 19 years of shared life. A language without words that could convey more in a single look than most people managed in a paragraph. "The lumber," Ilara said, gesturing toward the loaded wagon. "Where did you get it?" "I sold everything my husband left me except the wagon, the horse, and the clothes on my back." Dagny's voice was matter-of-fact, stripped of any self-pity. "This lumber is what I could afford with the money. It is not payment. It is investment in knowledge that might save my life someday." From that day forward, 3 women worked on the cave house instead of 2. Dagny proved herself invaluable almost immediately. She was stronger than she looked, capable of carrying loads that made even Ilara struggle. She had a practical mind that identified problems before they became serious. She asked intelligent questions and listened carefully to the answers. But she also had opinions, strong ones. The first real test of the grandfather's design came on a cold afternoon when they were ready to build the fireplace. Ilara had followed the journal's instructions precisely, positioning the stone hearth against the cave wall exactly where Old Leaf's drawings indicated, aligning it with the natural fissure in the rock that was supposed to serve as a chimney. They built it, stone by stone, over 3 days, fitted each piece with care, mixed mortar from materials Ilara had gathered according to notes in the journal. When the fireplace was finished, it looked exactly like the drawing. Solid, well-proportioned, positioned against the cave wall, with the fissure rising above it like a natural flue. Ilara stacked kindling inside, lit it, fed the small flame until it grew into a proper fire. And the smoke did not rise. Instead, it billowed outward from the fireplace in thick gray clouds that filled the cave within minutes. Seren began to cough, her eyes streaming. Dagny grabbed a blanket and tried to fan the smoke toward the entrance. Ilara stood before the fireplace she had spent 3 days building and watched her grandfather's design fail. The smoke was everywhere. It burned their eyes and scraped their throats and turned the air inside the cave into something that could not be breathed. They retreated to the entrance, gasping, while the fire consumed itself and the smoke slowly cleared. In the silence that followed, Dagny spoke first. "Maybe your grandfather drew this from memory," she said carefully. "Memory is not always precise, especially after years, especially about places a person has not visited in a long time." The words were gentle, but their implication was not. If the fireplace placement was wrong, if the journal's most critical measurement was inaccurate, then perhaps the entire design was unreliable. Perhaps the whole project was built on the faulty recollections of an old man who had confused what he wished were true with what actually was. Ilara did not sleep that night. She sat at the cave entrance with the journal open on her knees, reading and rereading the fireplace specifications by lantern light, while Stormer lay beside her and the mountain cold pressed against her back. The measurements were clear. The position was specific. The angle of the fissure was noted with the precision of a man who had measured it himself. So why had it failed? She went back to the cave wall the next morning. She climbed the scaffolding they had built and examined the fissure from above, pressing her face close to the rock, feeling for the draft that should have been there. And she found it. Or rather, she found where it should have been. The fissure was there. The gap in the rock was real. But between where the fireplace sat and where the fissure actually opened widest, there was a difference of roughly 3 feet. Her grandfather had marked the position relative to a distinctive outcropping of darker stone on the cave wall, a natural landmark that would have been unmistakable. But time and moisture had altered the surface. The dark stone had crumbled at its edges, shifted its apparent center. The landmark was still there, but it had moved. Not much, just enough. Ilara spent 2 days dismantling the fireplace and rebuilding it 3 feet to the left. 2 days of hauling stones she had already hauled. 2 days of mixing mortar she had already mixed. 2 days of work that felt like failure, even though she knew it was actually understanding. On the second evening, she lit the fire again. The smoke hesitated for a moment at the mouth of the fireplace. A moment long enough for Ilara's stomach to clench with dread. Then it caught the draft, rose, curled upward into the fissure, and disappeared into the rock above with a soft, steady pull that sounded almost like breathing. Seren, who had been standing near the entrance ready to run, lowered the cloth she had pressed over her mouth. Dagny crossed her arms and watched the smoke rise with an expression that was not quite satisfaction and not quite surprise, but somewhere in between. The look of a woman who had just learned something important about the difference between knowledge written in a book and knowledge earned through the work of applying it. The journal was right about the principle, Ilara said quietly, watching the smoke disappear into the mountain. But the details needed someone here, someone standing in this exact spot, looking at this exact wall. The knowledge is not complete without the person. Dagny nodded slowly. It was the closest she had come to an apology for her doubt, and it was enough. But they had lost nearly a week, and the clock Drummond had set was still ticking. As if summoned by the thought of him, Drummond arrived the following morning. He rode his horse up the mountain trail with the casual authority of a man who considered every inch of ground within his sight to be his by right, if not yet by law. He sat in the saddle for a full minute, surveying the cave, the half-built walls, the three women who had stopped working to watch him with expressions that ranged from cold fury to careful neutrality. "Building yourself a grave," he said finally. "That is what people are saying in town. The cursed twins, digging themselves a hole to die in." He shook his head with theatrical sorrow. "I must say, I did not expect you to make my work quite so easy." Ilara continued coiling the rope in her hands. She did not look at him. "I defended you," Drummond continued, his voice dripping with the particular kind of sympathy that costs nothing to offer and means even less. "When people called you unnatural, I said you were simply young and foolish, that you would come to your senses when you realized how difficult survival truly is. Now I see they were right about you all along." He leaned forward in his saddle. His eyes had the flat, calculating quality of a man who is measuring something he intends to acquire. "That cave will collapse when the rains come, or freeze you solid when your little fire cannot keep pace with a real storm, or simply drive you mad with the darkness and the silence and the knowledge that you are living like animals, while decent people sleep in proper homes above the ground where God intended." Ilara set down the rope and turned to face him. "Is that why you want our land so badly?" she asked. "Because you think we are going to die and leave it for you to claim?" Something flickered behind Drummond's eyes, a shutter opening and closing so fast that only someone watching very carefully would have caught it. "My offer still stands," he said smoothly. "Sell me the land, take the money, start a new life." "And if we refuse?" "I have been in correspondence with the judge about your situation. 2 women, unmarried, without male guardianship, attempting to hold property in ways that may not be entirely consistent with the law." He spread his hands in a gesture of helpless regret. "There are legal proceedings that may need to happen, for your own protection, of course." Ilara walked toward his horse until she stood close enough to touch it. "My grandfather claimed this land," she said, her voice as steady and cold as the winter air around them. "My father inherited it legally. We inherited it from our father according to the laws of this territory. There is no violation of any kind." "Judges interpret laws," Drummond replied, "and judges can often be persuaded to see things in new and interesting ways." He turned his horse and rode away without looking back. Sarin had stopped sketching. Her face was pale beneath the cold. "He means to take everything," she whispered. "Yes," Alara agreed. "He does. Can we stop him?" Alara looked at her sister, at the cave behind them, at the mountain rising into the gray sky. "We build faster," she said. "We finish before he can move against us. We prove that this is not abandoned property, not land held by helpless women who cannot care for themselves. We prove that we are here to stay." Then came the fourth. His name was Tobrin Whalen. He was 21 years old, the son of a miner who had died in one of Drummond's tunnels. His mother still lived in a drafty cabin on the edge of town, and she was sick. The kind of sick that cold made worse. The kind of sick that turned every winter into a countdown. He appeared at the cave entrance one afternoon, hat clutched nervously in his hands, dark eyes filled with the particular uncertainty of a young man who is about to ask for something he is not sure he deserves. "I came to learn," he said, echoing Dagny's words from weeks before. "My mother. The cold makes her cough through the night. All night. Every night. The doctor says she will not survive another cold season in our cabin. I need to build her something better, something that will keep her warm." Ilara studied him carefully. He was young, but clearly strong, capable of hard physical work. His clothes were worn, but clean. His hands were already calloused from labor. But there was something else in his eyes, something deeper than simple determination. "Why come to us?" she asked. "There are builders in town." Tobrin looked away, unable to meet her gaze. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with something that sounded like it had been waiting a long time to be said. "I was there when your father died in the mine. I was working the tunnel beside his when the supports gave way and everything came down." He paused, struggling. "I spoke to him just before it happened. He told me. He said he wished he had listened to his own father. That his father had known a better way to build, but he had been too proud to learn it." Ilara felt the air leave her lungs. "I did not understand what he meant," Tobrin continued quietly. "Not until I heard what you were doing up here. Building into the mountain the way your grandfather had designed. Then I understood." He finally looked up, meeting her eyes. "I cannot bring your father back. Nothing can change what happened. But I can learn what he should have learned. Maybe that means something. Maybe it does not. But I have to try." Saren had appeared beside Ilara during this exchange. She looked at Tobrin, at his worn clothes and calloused hands, and the haunted expression of a person carrying guilt he did not earn, but could not set down. "Can you handle an axe?" Saren asked. "Yes." "Can you follow instructions without arguing?" Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. "Yes." Saren glanced at her sister. Something passed between them without words. "Then come inside," Ilara said. "There is more than enough work." Tobrin became the fourth member of their crew. He worked harder than anyone Ilara had ever seen, arriving before dawn, staying until darkness made further work impossible. He never complained about the cold or the difficulty or the exhaustion. He never asked for anything in return. And slowly, as the days passed, Ilara began to notice something about the way he worked that set him apart from simple endurance. He learned. Not the way most people learn, passively, absorbing instructions and repeating them. but actively, hungrily, as if every technique she showed him was a piece of a puzzle he had been trying to solve his entire life. When she explained how her grandfather's design used the thermal mass of the cave wall to store and radiate heat, Tobrin did not just nod. He asked why the wall needed to be a certain thickness. He asked what happened if the air gap beneath the floor was wider or narrower. He asked questions that Ilara sometimes could not answer, questions that sent her back to the journal, searching for details she had overlooked. He brought information that changed everything. It happened one evening in the middle of winter's deepest hold, when the four of them sat by the fire at the cave entrance, resting after a long day. Dagny had been quiet most of the afternoon, the particular quiet of a person who is deciding whether or not to say something that cannot be unsaid. But it was Tobrin who spoke first. He had been staring into the fire with the unfocused gaze of someone replaying a memory they have replayed many times before. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and low. "Your father said something to me," he said, "in the tunnel, just before it happened. I have never told anyone because I did not understand what it meant. Not until now." Ilara went very still. He said he had wasted his life building the wrong way, that his own father had tried to teach him something important, something about how to build so the mountain worked with you instead of against you. But he had been too proud to listen, too ashamed of where his family came from. Tobrin paused. The fire popped and sent a constellation of sparks upward into the dark. He said if he could do one thing over, he would open that journal and build what his father designed. Those were almost the last words I heard him say. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight, the kind you can feel pressing against your skin. Ilara sat motionless, the journal resting on her knees, her father's tools arranged in their box 10 feet away, and she felt the full, terrible circle of it close around her heart. Her grandfather had begged her father to listen. Her father had refused. And in the last minutes of his life, trapped in a collapsing tunnel with the darkness closing in, he had finally understood what he had thrown away. Too late. Always too late. But not for his daughters. Not yet. Then Dagny reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper, worn and creased from much handling. "I found this hidden in my husband's things after he died," she said. "It is an old survey, geological, commissioned by the territorial government years ago." She unfolded it carefully and pointed to a faded marking on the map. "There is silver somewhere on this mountain, a small vein, but potentially valuable. The survey marks its approximate location." Ilara looked at where Dagny's finger rested on the map. The location was directly adjacent to their property line, perhaps on their land, perhaps just over the boundary. The old survey was not precise enough to say with certainty. "Drummond has been buying up land all around your property for years," Dagny continued. "Everyone assumed he was simply expanding, accumulating land because that is what rich men do. But I think he knows about this silver. I think he has always known. And I think the vein might extend onto your land." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Ilara stared at the faded map, her mind working through the implications, like fingers finding the shape of something hidden beneath cloth. This was why Drummond wanted their property, not because he cared about 2 orphaned women, not because he wanted to help them, because somewhere beneath their feet lay something he intended to possess by whatever means necessary. "We cannot mine silver," Seren said quietly. "We do not have the equipment or the knowledge." "No," Ilara agreed, "but we do not have to mine it. We just have to keep Drummond from taking our land." What happened next almost broke them. Dagny wanted to use the information about the silver publicly, bring it before the judge, expose Drummond's true motives, force everyone to see what kind of man he really was. A man who let miners die in unsafe tunnels to save money, who tried to steal land from orphaned girls because he knew there was wealth beneath it. "My husband died because of that man," Dagny said, and her voice carried a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. "He deserves to be exposed. He deserves to lose everything, the way I lost everything." Ilara understood the anger. She felt it herself, a constant low burn in her chest that flared every time she thought about Drummond's smooth voice and calculating eyes. But understanding the anger and acting on it were different things. "We do not have proof," she said. "We have an old survey that might or might not show silver on our land. If we go public with this, Drummond will deny everything. And then every fortune hunter in the territory will know there might be silver here. We will have more enemies, not fewer." "So you want me to stay silent?" Dagny's voice had gone dangerously flat. "You want me to pretend that the man who killed my husband is just another neighbor, just another face in town? I want us to survive the winter first. I want us to finish this house and establish our claim, and make sure Drummond cannot take our land through legal tricks. After that, what?" Dagny stood. Her shadow stretched across the cave wall behind her, large and sharp-edged. "After that, you will find another reason to wait, and another, and another. While Drummond continues to profit from the deaths of men like my husband." She left that night, walked down the mountain in the dark without a lantern, which was either very brave or very angry, or both. Ilara watched her go and felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. For 2 days they worked without her. The cave felt emptier than it should have, not just because they were short one pair of hands, but because the argument had cracked something between them that Ilara did not know how to repair. Dagny was right about Drummond. But being right and being strategic were not always the same thing, and Ilara could not afford to fight a battle she was not yet strong enough to win. On the third morning, Dagny's wagon appeared on the trail again. She climbed down without a word, picked up a saw, began cutting lumber as if she had never left. She did not apologize, and Ilara did not ask her to. But the tension remained between them, a third presence in every conversation, a weight in every silence, a reminder that alliances built from shared desperation are not the same as alliances built from shared trust. Trust would have to be earned, by all of them, over time. Meanwhile, something else was growing. Quieter than the tension with Dagny, but no less real. Ilara noticed it first in the way Tobrin listened when she explained the building principles from the journal. He did not just hear the words, he understood them. He asked questions that showed genuine comprehension, and sometimes suggested modifications that actually improved on the original designs. She noticed it in the way he anticipated what she needed before she asked. A beam held steady at exactly the right angle, a tool placed within reach at the precise moment it was required. The small, wordless efficiencies of someone who had learned to read another person's rhythm the way a musician reads a song. And she noticed, though she did not allow herself to dwell on it, the way his eyes found her across the worksite when he thought she was not looking. The way he smiled when she solved a problem that had stumped them all. The way he never tried to do her work for her, never assumed she needed help she had not requested, never treated her strength as something that diminished his own. They worked side by side through the deepest cold, and something grew between them like the walls of the cave house itself, slowly, steadily, fitted together with a care that neither of them spoke about, because there was too much else to do and too little time to do it in. But it was there, acknowledged in glances, in hands that brushed when passing tools, in the way they always seemed to know exactly where the other was without looking. The weeks blurred into each other, a rhythm of cutting, hauling, fitting, building that consumed every waking hour and most of the hours that should have been spent sleeping. The front wall rose log by log, each one fitted with a precision that improved as Alara's skills sharpened through repetition. Saren's designs guided everything. She had an eye for proportion that transformed functional construction into something that felt deliberate and beautiful, as if the cave house were not just a shelter, but a statement about what two women with no money and no help and no permission could create from raw material and inherited knowledge. The floor went down. Smooth planks raised above the stone on short supports, creating an insulating gap of air beneath. The windows were set into the front wall, the glass they had purchased with the last of their money catching the morning sun and throwing small rectangles of light across the interior that moved through the day like slow golden clocks. The sleeping loft took shape in the highest part of the cave, accessed by a ladder that Tobrin built with joints so tight they did not creak. And then, on a cold evening when the light was fading and they were preparing to stop for the night, something happened that made everything else seem small. Ilara lit the fireplace. Not the tentative test fire she had lit before. A real fire. A winter fire. She stacked logs thick and heavy in the rebuilt hearth and touched a match to the kindling beneath them and watched the flames rise and catch and grow until the fire roared with a steady, deep-voiced authority that filled the cave with warmth and dancing light. The smoke rose, caught the draft, disappeared into the fissure above without a trace. Clean and perfect, exactly as old Leif had designed it to work. And the warmth. The warmth was like nothing any of them had ever felt in a mountain dwelling. It did not fight against the cold the way heat fought cold in a wooden cabin, a constant, exhausting battle that the fire could never quite win. Instead, the heat from the fireplace was absorbed by the stone walls, held there, and radiated back in every direction. The cave itself became a reservoir of warmth, storing heat the way a bank stores money, releasing it slowly and steadily long after the flames had died to embers. Seren placed her palm flat against the cave wall and held it there. Her eyes widened. "The stone is warm," she said. "The wall itself is warm." She looked at Alara, and for the first time since their parents had died, perhaps for the first time in years, something like light showed in her face. Not just hope, something deeper than hope. The look of a person who has just discovered that the world contains possibilities they had never imagined. Dagny stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching the fire with an expression that was harder to read. But her shoulders had dropped slightly from their permanent position of defensive tension. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than Alara had ever heard it. "My cabin," she said. 20 years I lived in that cabin. 20 winters I spent feeding a fire that could never keep up with the cold coming through the walls. And all that time, the answer was here, right here, inside the mountain. She turned and walked outside without another word. But through the cave entrance, Alara could see her standing in the snow, looking up at the mountain above them. And although Dagny's back was turned and her face was hidden, something about the way she stood suggested that she was crying. Not from sadness, from something else entirely. The particular grief of realizing that suffering you accepted as inevitable was actually suffering that could have been prevented if only someone had known. If only someone had listened. Tobrin caught Alara's eye across the firelit cave. He did not speak. He simply nodded, a small, quiet acknowledgement of what they had accomplished and what it meant. And in that nod was everything he had not yet said, and everything she had not yet been ready to hear. Outside, the winter pressed against the mountainside with all its ancient weight. But inside the cave house, the fire burned and the walls held, and the temperature climbed to a warmth that felt almost impossible after so many years of cold. The proof was undeniable. The principle worked. Old Leaf's design, refined by Alara's hands, guided by Saren's eye, supported by Dagny's strength and Tobrin's labor, was everything the journal had promised. But even as the warmth settled into the stone and the firelight painted moving shadows on the cave walls, Alara could not fully relax, because she had learned something in the weeks since she first opened that journal. The knowledge was real. The design was sound. The mountain would protect them, but only if they finished in time. Only if they completed every wall and sealed every gap and made this dwelling so undeniably permanent that no judge in any court could call it abandoned. Drummond was out there. His lawyers were preparing. The clock he had set was still counting down toward spring, when the legal machinery would grind into motion and everything they had built could be taken away with the stroke of a pen. And there was something else, something Alara had noticed that she had not yet mentioned to anyone, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Stormer had been restless for days. The old wolf dog, who normally spent his hours sleeping by whatever fire was available, had taken to pacing, back and forth across the cave floor, back and forth along the entrance, his ancient eyes scanning the sky with an intensity that seemed to belong to a much younger animal. He whined softly in his throat. He refused to settle. And when Alara followed his gaze upward, she noticed that the sky above the mountain peaks had begun to change. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have described to someone who was not paying close attention. But the blue had taken on a quality she had never seen before. A faint yellowish cast at the edges, like old paper, like something that had been white once and was slowly turning the color of a bruise. Old Arvid, an 82-year-old man who lived alone in a cabin further up the valley, and who occasionally appeared at the cave site to watch them work with sharp, evaluating eyes, had stopped by that afternoon. He had stood at the entrance for a long time, saying nothing, his gnarled hands gripping his walking stick. Then he had looked at the sky, and his weathered face had tightened in a way that made Ilara's stomach drop. "Keep building," he had said. Just that, nothing more. And then he had turned and walked away down the mountain, with more urgency in his step than she had ever seen from a man his age. Stormer watched him go. Then the old wolf dog raised his muzzle toward the strange, discolored sky and let out a sound that was not quite a howl and not quite a whimper. Something in between, something ancient, something that seemed to come from a place deeper than instinct. Ilara looked at the cave house, at the walls that were nearly complete, at the roof that was almost finished, at the fireplace that worked, and the floor that was laid, and the windows that caught the light. Almost done, almost ready, almost safe, almost. She picked up her axe and went back to work. There was no time to wonder what the sky was trying to say. There was only time to build. And somewhere in the town below, in a warm office with leather chairs and a silver watch ticking on a polished desk, Silas Drummond was also working. Not with an axe, not with his hands, with paper and ink, and the particular patience of a man who has learned that the most effective way to destroy something is not with force, but with procedure. With filings and petitions and conversations held in rooms where ordinary people were not invited. Spring was coming, the courts would open, and when they did, everything the twins had built, every wall, every stone, every hour of exhausting labor, would be measured against words written on documents they had never seen, by men they had never met, in service of interests they were only beginning to understand. The race was not against winter alone. It was against everything winter was hiding. The accident happened on a morning that had started like every other morning, with work. They were fitting the main support beam for the sleeping loft into place. It was the single heaviest piece of timber in the entire structure. Nearly 20 feet long and thick as a man's torso, cut from the straightest Douglas fir they could find on the mountainside. Positioning it correctly required all four of them working in perfect coordination, because the beam had to slide into sockets they had carved into opposite walls at exactly the same angle. And if it went in crooked, the entire loft would be compromised. Ilara stood on the scaffolding they had constructed, guiding the beam's upper end toward its socket. Seren stood below, calling out adjustments based on her design drawings, her artist's eye catching deviations of a quarter-inch that no one else could see. Tobrin and Dagny held ropes attached to a pulley system, controlling the beam's slow rise into position. The rope slipped. Perhaps it was worn in a spot they had not noticed. Perhaps the knot was not as tight as it should have been. Perhaps it was simply the accumulated weight of too many things going right for too long, and the universe correcting itself with the cold indifference that the universe has always shown toward people who dare to believe they might succeed. The beam swung free. It dropped several feet before the backup rope caught it, and in that moment, that fraction of a second between falling and catching, the massive timber swung sideways like a pendulum made of wood and gravity and terrible luck. Alara shouted a warning. Serene turned at the sound of her sister's voice. She saw the beam coming. She had no time to move. Dagny threw herself forward. She did not think about it, did not calculate the risk or weigh the consequences. She simply moved. The way a person moves when someone they care about is in danger, and the body acts before the mind can interfere with something as useless as caution. She shoved Serene aside with both hands, putting all her strength into the push. Serene stumbled backward, off balance, but clear. Dagny was not clear. The swinging timber caught her across the shoulder with a sound that Alara would hear in her nightmares for months afterward. Not a crack exactly, but something worse, something wet and structural. The sound of a joint being forced in a direction joints are not designed to go. Dagny spun, hit the cave floor hard, and the beam was still moving. Serene, knocked off balance by Dagny's push, stumbled backward over a pile of lumber. Her foot caught on a protruding log. She fell, twisting as she went down, her body turning in the air with the particular helplessness of a person who has lost all control over where they are going to land. The beam completed its arc and came to rest across her outstretched leg with the finality of a door closing on something that would never be quite the same again. Alara was down the scaffolding in seconds, but the damage was already done. Serene lay on the cave floor, her face white with shock, her leg pinned beneath the timber. She had not screamed. She had made no sound at all. The silence was worse than screaming. It was the silence of a body so overwhelmed by pain that it had forgotten how to protest. "Do not try to move her." Dagny was on the ground nearby, clutching her shoulder with her good hand, her face gray, but her eyes sharp and focused. "We need to lift the beam straight up. If we drag it, the break will be worse." Tobrin was already in position. Alara joined him. Together they gripped the timber and lifted. Every muscle, every tendon, every ounce of strength they had left after weeks of exhausting labor poured into a single upward movement that felt like trying to lift the mountain itself. The beam rose. Dagny, despite her ruined shoulder, crawled forward and pulled Serene clear. They lowered the timber carefully to the floor, and then they saw what the beam had done. The angle was wrong below the knee. The swelling had already begun, distorting the shape of Serene's calf into something that did not look like a leg anymore. She had still not screamed, but small sounds escaped her now. Whimpers she could not suppress. The involuntary language of a body trying to communicate damage it cannot repair on its own. "We need a doctor," Tobrin said. "The doctor in town will not come." Dagny's voice was flat with bitter certainty. "He is afraid of the cursed twins. He told me so himself. He wants no part of their misfortune." Alara felt rage rise in her chest, hot and bitter and absolutely useless. Because rage could not set a broken bone, and anger could not undo what had already been done. Her sister was injured. The only doctor within walking distance refused to help. And outside the cave, Winter waited with the patient cruelty of something that never gets tired and never gives up. Tobrin touched her arm. "There is a retired doctor in the next valley over. Old, but his hands are still steady. He treats people that other doctors refuse to see. He might come." "Go," Alara said. "Ride as fast as you can." Tobrin was on his horse and gone within minutes, disappearing down the mountain trail at a speed that was dangerous in the best conditions and nearly suicidal in snow. Alara watched him go and felt something tear inside her chest. not for herself, but for the simple fact that a person she had come to depend on was now riding into the dark on her behalf. And she could do nothing but wait. The wait lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of sitting beside Seren, holding her hand, watching her sister's face cycle through expressions of pain that no 19-year-old face should ever have to wear. Dagny made a temporary splint from scrap wood, immobilizing the leg as best she could with one functioning arm, but they all knew it was not enough. Seren drifted in and out of consciousness. In her lucid moments, she tried to speak. "I ruined everything," she whispered. "No, we cannot finish without me. The project will fail. Everyone was right about us." Ilara squeezed her sister's hand. "Listen to me. Your leg is broken, not your mind. You can still design. You can still draw. You can still tell us what to do and how to do it. When your leg heals, you will walk again, and we will finish this house together, exactly as we planned." Seren's pained eyes found her sister's face. "You promise?" "I promise." The doctor arrived as darkness fell. His name was Dr. Whitfield. He was 73 years old, retired from practice for nearly a decade, living alone with his medical books and his memories. But his hands were still steady when they needed to be, and his eyes were still sharp enough to see what needed seeing. He examined the leg with gentle, precise fingers. "Simple fracture," he said after careful palpation. "Clean break. She will walk again, but not for 6 to 8 weeks. And she must not put any weight on this leg until it is healed properly, or she risks permanent damage." He set the bone while Ilara held Seren's hand, and Dagny held her shoulders steady. Seren screamed once, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her body, from some reservoir of pain that had been accumulating since the day her parents died. Then she fainted, which the old doctor said was probably a mercy. He reset Dagny's dislocated shoulder with a quick, practiced movement. Then he washed his hands and looked around the cave house with eyes that seemed to be seeing something beyond the walls and the scaffolding and the half-finished construction. "I have seen houses like this," he said thoughtfully. "Many years ago, in the old country, before I came here. My wife was from a village where they built this way, into the hillside, using the earth as insulation." He paused, remembering. Her people survived winters that would have killed anyone who tried to fight the cold instead of working with it. He turned to Ilara with an expression that was serious but not unkind. "Your grandfather was a wise man. Finish what he designed. But be careful. The world has a way of punishing women who dare to do things differently." He left with a promise to return in 2 weeks. The darkness swallowed him and his horse, and the 4 of them, 3 injured, 1 exhausted beyond description, were alone again. What followed was a transformation. Seren could not walk. She could barely sit up without waves of pain rolling through her broken leg. She was confined to a makeshift bed in the corner of the cave, unable to lift a hammer or carry a board or do any of the physical work that had defined her contribution to the project. But she could still think. She could still see. And she could still draw. From her bed, Seren became the architect and commander of everything they built. She sketched detailed plans for every remaining element of the house, calculating angles and measurements with a mathematical precision that surprised everyone, including herself. She had always drawn for beauty, to make things pleasing, proportional, harmonious. Now she discovered that the same eye that could compose a beautiful sketch could also solve structural problems with an efficiency that none of them had expected. She directed the placement of every beam, the positioning of every stone, the angle of every joint. Her injury had taken away her ability to work with her hands. It had given her something in return, the time and the necessity to work with her mind in ways she had never been forced to try before. And Alara built exactly what Saren designed. She worked 16-hour days, pushing herself past exhaustion into some strange territory beyond tiredness, where every movement was automatic and only willpower kept her body upright. Tobrin worked beside her, matching her hour for hour, his strength a quiet constant that she leaned on more than she would have admitted. Dagny, her shoulder slowly healing, did what she could with one good arm, which turned out to be considerably more than most people could do with two. They worked through days so cold that their breath froze on their scarves. They worked through setbacks that would have stopped anyone with less at stake. They worked through the knowledge that somewhere below them, in a warm office in town, a rich man was preparing documents that could erase everything they had accomplished with a signature and a seal. The court summons arrived on a morning that smelled like approaching spring. Drummond had filed a formal petition declaring the Halverson property abandoned and requesting that ownership be transferred to him as the nearest substantial landholder with the resources to develop it properly. He claimed the sisters had left their legal homestead and were living in a primitive cave dwelling that did not constitute proper occupation under the law. The hearing was set for less than 3 weeks away. Ilara read the summons twice. Then she crumpled it in her fist and spoke in a voice so quiet that Tobrin, standing beside her, had to lean closer to hear. He is claiming we abandoned our own land. But we are living here, Dagny pointed out. This is our home. But it is not officially completed, and we have not filed paperwork establishing residence. From her bed, Saren spoke with a firmness that cut through the fear like a blade through rope. Then we finish. Every detail, every wall, every piece of paper that needs filing. We show the judge that this is a permanent, legal residence occupied by its rightful owners. In 3 weeks, Ilara said. We need at least another month. Then we sleep less. We do whatever is necessary. Saren's eyes were fierce, despite her pain and exhaustion. We did not fight this hard to let him win now. They finished 2 days before the hearing. Ilara stood at the entrance of the cave house in the golden light of late afternoon and looked at what they had built. The front wall rose 12 feet, solid logs fitted together with a precision that had improved with every joint she cut. 2 glass windows flanked the door, letting warm light into the interior. The cedar shingle roof pitched upward into the natural ceiling of the cave. Inside, the floor was smooth and level. The massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its carefully constructed hearth radiating warmth. A sturdy ladder led to the sleeping loft. A table and chairs occupied the main living space. Simple, but well made. This was not a cave. This was a home. The hearing lasted most of the day. Drummond's lawyers presented their case with professional polish. The property was unoccupied, the original cabin abandoned. Two women without male guardianship could not legally hold land. When it was Alara's turn, she stood, without notes, without prepared arguments, without anything except the truth and her grandfather's journal. "This journal contains the original documentation of our land," she said clearly. "My grandfather purchased it legally from the territorial government. My father inherited it when my grandfather died. We inherited it from our father, and we are living on it now, in a permanent dwelling we built with our own hands." She presented the journal. She presented Dr. Whitfield's signed statement confirming multiple medical visits to their residence. She presented written statements from witnesses confirming continuous occupation. The judge examined everything carefully. Then he looked at Drummond's lawyers, and his expression suggested that he had seen exactly what kind of case they had brought before him, and was not impressed. "The petition is denied," he said. "This case is dismissed with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled. And I would strongly caution certain parties against further attempts to manipulate this court." Outside the courthouse, Drummond found Ilara on the steps. His face was flushed. The polished mask of concern had fallen away entirely, revealing something underneath that was smaller and meaner and far more honest than anything he had ever shown in public. "You have won this battle," he said, his voice low and venomous. "But winter will come again. And when it does, when your precious cave proves as worthless as every other shelter in these mountains, I will still be here, waiting." Ilara looked at him without fear. "Your threats mean nothing to stone and earth," she said calmly. "We will still be standing when the snow falls, and the snow after that, and every snow that comes." She walked away without looking back. Then the sky changed. It happened over 3 consecutive days. The blue drained out of the heavens, as if someone were slowly pouring something else in. Something sickly, something wrong. The sky turned yellow, not the warm yellow of sunlight or autumn leaves, but a diseased yellow, the color of old bruises, the color of warnings written in a language older than words. Old Arvid came to the cave house. He walked with the urgency of a much younger man, his 82-year-old legs finding speed that should not have been possible. His face was drawn tight with genuine fear, not the performed concern of a man like Drummond, but the real, bone-deep terror of someone who has lived long enough to recognize a sign that most people have never seen and pray they never will. "That sky," he said, pointing upward with a finger that trembled. "I have seen that color twice before in my long life. Both times, storms followed. Storms that killed." He grabbed Ilara's arm with surprising strength. "Whatever you have built in that cave, it needs to be strong enough, because what is coming will test everything." He left without another word. That night, Ilara and Tobrin stacked firewood inside the cave until the piles reached the ceiling. They filled every container with water. They brought inside every preserved food item they had prepared during the warmer months. They reinforced the door with additional bars. And Stormer did not stop howling until dawn. The storm arrived on a morning that began with a sound like distant thunder rolling across the peaks, though no lightning flickered in the sickly sky. The sound was wind. building somewhere in the high passes above the valley, gathering strength, preparing to descend with a fury that the mountain towns below could not yet imagine, but would soon be unable to forget. By noon, the wind was screaming across the mountainside, tearing branches from trees and sending them spinning through the air. By nightfall, the cold had deepened past anything Alara had ever experienced. A cold so intense, it felt personal, as if the air itself had decided to become hostile to everything that breathed. By midnight, visibility had been reduced to nothing. White chaos filled the world outside the cave house, and the snow driven by the shrieking wind piled against the entrance in drifts that grew higher with every passing hour. Inside the cave house, Alara fed the fire and watched the walls. Outside, a killing cold that turned the world into something actively hostile to life. Inside, warmth. Steady, stable, constant warmth held in stone walls that did not care about the wind or the snow, or the fury of a sky that had turned the color of sickness. The cave house was holding. The principal's old leaf had spent his life refining, were proving themselves beyond any possible argument. The first night passed. The second day brought no relief. If anything, the storm intensified, the wind finding new registers of howling, the cold deepening past anything that felt natural, as if the winter itself were making a point that it wanted no one to miss. Alara did not sleep. She sat in a chair near the door, listening for any sound of failure, any creak or groan that might signal weakness in the structure. But the walls held firm. The roof remained secure. The fireplace drew perfectly, the smoke disappearing into the mountain as if the stone were breathing it in. She thought about her grandfather, about the drawings in his journal, each line placed with the certainty of a man who understood that the difference between a shelter and a coffin is measured in details. Every angle he had calculated, every proportion he had specified, every principle he had distilled from generations of building in climates that did not forgive mistakes. All of it was being tested right now, in real time, against the worst that this mountain could produce. And it was holding. Every wall, every joint, every carefully positioned stone in the fireplace that she had rebuilt with her own bleeding hands. It was all holding. Around her, the others slept. Serin in her bed near the fire, Dagny on her cot against the wall, Tobrin on a pallet near the door, ready to help if needed, and Stormer lay at Alara's feet, his old eyes open and watchful, sharing the vigil with the woman who had become his final companion. The pounding came at 2 a.m. on the third night. Stormer heard it first. The old wolf dog leaped to his feet with more energy than he had shown in months, a growl building deep in his throat, the hackles rising along his spine in a ridge of silver-gray fur that made him look, for just a moment, like the wild animal his blood remembered being. Alara was at the door before anyone else had stirred. The sound came again, faint but desperate, rhythmic but weakening. Someone was out there. Someone was pounding on the door with the last of their strength. She looked at Tobrin, who had appeared at her shoulder with a lantern. Their eyes met in the flickering light. Then she lifted the bar and pulled the door open. The wind hit her like a fist. Snow and ice drove into her face. Cold clawed at every inch of exposed skin, trying to steal the warmth from her body in the seconds it took to see what was standing on the other side of the threshold. Two figures, one tall, broad-shouldered, expensive coat crusted with ice that had formed from his own frozen breath. The silver watch chain invisible under layers of frost. The other, smaller, slumped against the first, clearly unable to stand without support. Silas Drummond and his wife, Lillian. Ilara stood frozen in the doorway for one eternal second. This was the man who had tried to steal her land through legal manipulation. The man who had called her cursed and unnatural. The man who had threatened that winter would prove her wrong about everything. And now he stood at her door, his wife dying in his arms, his fortune buried under the rubble of a collapsed mansion somewhere down the mountain, his arrogance stripped away by a cold so absolute that it left no room for anything except the truth of what a person actually needed to survive. Saren appeared at Ilara's shoulder. She had pulled herself from bed, balanced on her good leg, and limped to the door without anyone noticing. She looked at Drummond. She looked at Lillian's blue lips and blackened fingertips. She looked at the storm raging behind them. "They will die out there," she said quietly. "In minutes." Ilara reached into the howling wind, grabbed Drummond's frozen arm, and pulled. "Come inside," she shouted over the roar. "Now! Move!" They hauled the Drummonds through the doorway. Tobrin threw his weight against the door. The bar dropped back into place. And then, in the sudden silence that followed the closing of that door, they all stood looking at what the storm had delivered. Lillian Drummond was dying. Her lips had turned the color of a winter sky just before the worst of the cold arrives. Her fingertips were blackened. Her breathing was shallow and growing shallower. Silas was not much better. His hands were damaged, his face raw and bleeding from ice crystals driven into the skin. "Our house," he managed through chattering teeth. "The roof collapsed. The chimney failed. Everything. We had nowhere else to go." Ilara looked at the man who had spent months trying to destroy her. Then she looked at his wife, who had never done anything wrong except marry a cruel man. "Dagny, every blanket we have. Tobrin, heat water. Saren, help me get these wet clothes off before they freeze to death in our home." For 3 hours, they fought to keep Lillian Drummond alive. They stripped away frozen clothing and wrapped her in every blanket and quilt they possessed. They placed heated stones around her body. They forced warm broth into her mouth, spoonful by spoonful, until she could swallow on her own, and color began returning to her gray cheeks. The storm continued, and with each passing hour, more refugees arrived at the cave house door. On the morning of the 4th day, Reverend Harlan appeared, the same minister who had preached against the twins from his pulpit. His church roof had collapsed. His wife and 3 children huddled behind him, shivering, terrified, stripped of every comfort except the desperate hope that the women he had condemned would not turn them away. Ilara let them in without a word. Later that same day, Virgil arrived. The young man who had wagered $20 that the cave house would collapse was half carrying his 7-year-old sister Brinley through snow that came up to his waist. Their parents had gone out during a brief lull in the storm to check on their livestock. They had not come back. Virgil wept as he carried his silent sister through the door. He thanked Ilara over and over in words that came out broken and incoherent and so saturated with gratitude that they barely sounded like language at all. By the end of the 4th day, 16 people crowded into the cave house that everyone had said would fail. 16 people, most of whom had laughed at the Halverson sisters, called them cursed, refused to help, tried to take their land. Now they pressed together around the fire, sharing blankets, sharing food, sharing survival. There was a moment on the 4th night that Ilara would carry with her for the rest of her life. Little Brinley had not spoken since her brother carried her through the door. She sat in a corner, wrapped in blankets, her eyes staring at nothing. Virgil had tried everything, talking softly, offering food, holding her close. Nothing reached her. She was locked inside herself, trapped by something too large for a 7-year-old mind to hold. Stormer rose from his spot near the fire. The old wolf dog, who had barely moved in days, who had been conserving the last of his fading strength for some purpose only he understood, stood on his stiff legs and walked across the crowded room. People shifted aside to let him pass. He stopped beside Brinley. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking at the little girl with his ancient, knowing eyes. Then he lay down beside her, pressing his warm body against hers, and rested his grizzled head gently on her lap. Brinley looked down. Her small hands, raw and red from cold, reached out hesitantly and touched his silver fur. "Is he scared?" she asked. Her voice was tiny. They were the first words she had spoken in 3 days. Ilara knelt beside the child. "No," she said gently. "Stormer is never scared. He is very old and very wise, and he has seen many storms. He knows that storms always end. And he knows when someone needs a friend to sit beside them until it is over." Brinley's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks in silent streams. She wrapped her thin arms around Stormer's neck and buried her face in his fur. And finally, she began to cry. Great heaving sobs that shook her small body, releasing grief and fear and a loneliness so vast it seemed impossible that it could fit inside such a small person. The sound was painful to hear, but it was also the sound of something beginning to mend. The storm broke on the morning of the 6th day. Ilara woke to silence, true silence, the complete absence of wind, the sudden peace that follows great violence. She opened the door. The world outside had been utterly transformed. Snow lay deep in every direction, forming drifts and sculptures that bore no resemblance to the landscape she had known. Trees were down everywhere, massive pines snapped by the wind. The sky was pale, perfect blue, serene, as if the storm had never happened at all. But the storm had happened, and its consequences were only beginning to be understood. They dug pathways through the snow over the following days.
As the refugees departed to assess their homes, the scope of the damage became clear. 7 houses destroyed. The church had lost its roof.
The general store had partially collapsed. Drummond's mansion was a total ruin. And there were deaths. 4 people had not survived. An old man who lived alone at the edge of town found sitting upright in his chair as if he had simply stopped. A young mother and her infant daughter, driven from their cabin when the chimney failed, found together in the snow within sight of their door. A miner who had tried to reach his livestock during what seemed like a lull. The lull had ended with sudden fury. He never made it back. 4 people who might have lived if their shelters had been stronger. 4 people whose deaths proved that knowledge passed down through generations could mean the difference between living and dying. Alara stood in the ruins of Drummond's mansion on a bright, cold morning, surrounded by the scattered remnants of his wealth. Shattered timber, twisted metal, the fragments of a life built on the assumption that money could buy safety and power, could purchase permanence. She felt no joy at the sight, no vindication, only a sadness so heavy it felt like carrying another person inside her body. The weight of knowing that none of this destruction had been inevitable. That if people had listened, if pride had not blinded them, if fear of the unfamiliar had not been stronger than the desire to survive, these ruins could have remained homes. These deaths could have remained lives. The community gathered at the damaged church 2 weeks after the storm ended. The building still lacked a roof. Cold air moved freely through the space, but every seat was filled. 34 people who had survived, many bearing visible marks of what the cold had done to their bodies. Blackened fingers, frost-damaged ears, faces still raw and swollen. All of them looked at the Halverson sisters differently now. Silas Drummond stood first. He was not the same man who had threatened Alara on the courthouse steps. His hands were heavily bandaged. 2 of his fingers would never fully recover. His silver watch chain was notably absent. His entire bearing had changed, as if the storm had stripped away the arrogance the way it had stripped the roof from his mansion, leaving something underneath that was smaller and more human, and possibly more honest. "I need to say something," he began. The ruined church fell silent. For months, I told anyone who would listen that Alara Halverson was building herself a grave. I called her cursed. I called her primitive. I tried to take her land through the courts because I believed she had no right to own property or make decisions or do anything except accept the charity of people who considered themselves her betters. He paused. His bandaged hands trembled at his sides. On the 3rd night, my roof collapsed. My wife was dying, and I had only one place to go, one shelter I knew would still be standing. He turned to look directly at Alara. I walked through the worst storm of my life to reach the door of the woman I had tried to destroy. And when I arrived, freezing, desperate, with nothing left but my dying wife and my ruined pride, she opened the door without hesitation, without conditions, without even a moment of satisfaction at seeing me brought so low. His voice cracked. "She saved my wife's life. she saved mine. She saved 16 people with knowledge I called foolish and outdated and primitive. He sat down heavily, as if the speech had cost him the last of something he had been holding on to for a very long time. Reverend Harlan stood next, then Virgil, who pressed a worn $20 bill into Alara's hand with tears running down his frost-damaged face. "You won the bet," he said quietly, "but you won something worth a lot more than $20. One by one they came forward, the shopkeeper, the doctor who had refused to treat Saren, the women who had whispered behind their hands, each carrying an apology that felt too small for the wrong it was trying to correct, but offering it anyway because it was all they had. When the last person had spoken, Ilara stood. "We did not build our home to prove anyone wrong," she said, and her voice carried clearly through the roofless church, rising into the open sky above. "We built it to survive. Our grandfather designed it. Our father should have built it, but was too proud. We were left with no choice except to try." She looked around at the gathered faces. "The storm is over, but winter is not finished, and the next winter will come, and the one after that. If you want to learn what our grandfather knew, we will teach you. Not for money, not for apologies, but because knowledge should be shared, and because no one else should ever die from cold that could have been prevented." She paused, and in the silence, the wind moved gently through the open roof above them. Cold, but calm now. The kind of wind that comes after fury has exhausted itself, and all that remains is the quiet work of rebuilding. What matters now is not who was right or who was wrong. What matters is that we are all still breathing. Let us make sure that when the next storm comes, everyone survives. Drummond, the man who had tried to take everything from her, was the first to ask if he could learn. The months that followed the storm passed with the quiet urgency of a valley learning to rebuild itself from the inside out. Spring arrived slowly, as if the winter were reluctant to release its grip. But eventually the snow melted. The streams began to flow. The world that had seemed permanently frozen came back to life in shades of green that felt almost aggressive after so many months of white and gray and the bruised yellow of a sky that no one in town would ever forget. Ilara taught the first class on a morning when the wildflowers were just beginning to push through the last patches of snow. 7 people came, 5 men and 2 women, standing in a rough semicircle outside the cave house, shifting their weight from foot to foot with the particular discomfort of people who are about to learn something from a person they once dismissed. She showed them the journal first, passed it around carefully, letting each person hold the leather-bound pages and study the drawings that old Leif had made with such precision decades ago. She explained the principles, not as lectures, but as demonstrations. She pressed her palm against the cave wall and let them feel the constant temperature for themselves. She showed them how the fireplace worked, how the fissure drew the smoke, how the stone absorbed heat and released it slowly through the coldest hours of the night. They asked questions she had not expected. A farmer wanted to know if the same principles could be applied to a root cellar. A widow asked whether a smaller version could work for a single person living alone. A young man who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite during the storm asked if the technique could be adapted for livestock shelters, because animals died in cold winters too,
and every dead animal was a family that might not eat the following year. Ilara answered what she could. When she could not answer, she said so honestly. And then she went home and studied the journal and experimented, and came back the following week with solutions she had worked out through the same process her grandfather had used: observation, measurement, trial, error, and the willingness to rebuild what failed until it succeeded. She did not mention the months of mockery.
She did not remind anyone of the sermons preached against her, or the bets placed on her failure, or the legal petition that had tried to take everything she owned. She simply taught. And the people who had once called her cursed listened with the careful attention of students who understand that the knowledge being offered might someday save their lives. By summer, 5 new earth-sheltered homes were under construction in the valley. By the following winter, there were 12. By the winter after that, 30 families lived in dwellings that used the principles old Leif had refined. Homes built into hillsides, nestled against rock faces, designed to work with the mountain instead of against it. Dagny ran the building school. She had found her purpose in the wreckage of the storm. Not as a builder herself, though she could build as well as anyone, but as a teacher. She taught widowed women the skills they needed to construct and maintain their own shelters. She taught them to read plans, to calculate load-bearing capacity, to mix mortar and fit joints, and understand the relationship between stone and heat, and the movement of air through enclosed spaces. She never remarried. When someone once asked her why, she said that she had been lucky enough to have one good husband and saw no reason to test her luck twice. But she was never alone. Her students became something closer than friends, a network of capable, self-sufficient women who had learned that survival was not a gift bestowed by others, but a skill that could be practiced and perfected and passed along. The tension between Dagny and Ilara never fully disappeared. It softened over the years, worn smooth by shared work and mutual respect, the way river stones are smoothed by the constant passage of water. They never agreed about Drummond. Dagny believed he should have faced public accountability for the miners who died in his tunnels. And Ilara believed that the storm had delivered a reckoning more complete than any court proceeding could have achieved. They argued about it occasionally, with the comfortable heat of people who have earned the right to disagree without the disagreement threatening the foundation of what they had built together. A surveyor confirmed what Dagny's old document had suggested. There was silver beneath the Halverson land. A small vein, not enough to build an empire, but enough to matter. Drummond came to Ilara with a proposal. He would provide equipment and expertise. They would split the profits. Together, he said, they could extract the silver and build something substantial. Ilara considered the offer for 3 days. She walked the land above the cave house each morning, looking at the mountain that had sheltered her, feeling the ground beneath her boots, and knowing that somewhere down there, hidden in rock and darkness, lay something that men had killed for and would kill for again if given the chance. She thought about what the silver could buy: better tools, more materials, a larger school, security against every future threat that she could not yet imagine. She thought about what her father would have done,
Henrik, who had spent his life chasing silver in other men's mines, who had died underground, searching for exactly what now lay beneath his daughter's feet. Then she refused. "The mountain has given us enough," she told Drummond. "Warmth, shelter, survival. Everything my grandfather promised. I will not repay that gift by tearing the mountain apart for silver we do not need." Instead, she sold the mining rights to a cooperative of local families, the same families whose members had sheltered in her cave house during the storm. The price was modest, but it was enough to fund Dagny's building school for years to come. The silver remained mostly in the ground, a treasure the mountain kept for itself. Drummond never rebuilt his mansion. He lived out his remaining years in a modest cottage on the edge of town, a simple dwelling that Tobrin helped him insulate using the techniques he had learned from Alara. His wife Lillian, whose life had been saved in the cave house, became one of Alara's most dedicated students. She learned the old building methods and taught them to her neighbors, and eventually to her own grandchildren, with the quiet fervor of a woman who understood exactly what it meant to owe your life to knowledge that others had dismissed as worthless. When Drummond died, years later in his small cottage with Lillian beside him and a fire burning in a hearth that Tobrin had built, his will contained a surprise that no one expected. He left his remaining land holdings not to distant relatives, but to a trust that would fund the education of orphaned children in the valley. Children like the Halverson sisters had once been. The trust was named in honor of old Leif. Ilara attended the funeral. She did not speak, but she stood at the graveside until all the other mourners had departed, remembering the man who had tried to destroy her and who had been destroyed instead by his own arrogance, and rebuilt, in some small measure, by the mercy she had shown him on the worst night of his life. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not something she had ever been asked to give, and she was not certain she would have given it if asked. But she understood him, understood the fear that drives a man to accumulate power, the loneliness that power creates, the terrible discovery that everything you built to protect yourself can collapse in a single night, while the thing you mocked stands firm. Understanding was enough. It would have to be. Brinley's parents were never found. When the spring thaw revealed the secrets the snow had hidden, many things were recovered from unexpected places. But Thomas and Mary Crawford had vanished completely, swallowed by the storm, leaving no trace of their final moments. Virgil, at 23, became both brother and father to his 7-year-old sister. He brought Brinley to live in a small cave house he built himself, following Ilara's careful guidance, carved into a hillside not far from the original. Brinley grew up there, warm and safe through every winter, with a wolf dog puppy that Ilara gave her on her 8th birthday. She named him Stormer II. Years later, when Brinley became the first woman elected to the town council, she told anyone who would listen that she owed her life to 2 things: a cave house that kept her warm when the world outside wanted to kill her, and an old wolf dog who had taught her that even in the darkest hours, someone would always come to sit beside her until the storm was over. On a warm afternoon in late spring, Tobrin asked Ilara to walk with him. They climbed to the meadow above the cave house, the same meadow where wildflowers were beginning to bloom in carpets of purple and yellow and white. The peaks rose around them,
still capped with snow that gleamed in the afternoon sun, like something precious that the mountain was holding up for the sky to see. Tobrin was nervous. His hands would not stay still. His eyes kept moving, to Alara's face, then away, then back again, with the restless energy of a man who has decided to say something that cannot be unsaid, and is trying to find the exact right moment to begin. "I came to you to learn how to build," he said finally. "My mother was sick. She was dying in a cold cabin. I needed knowledge that could save her. That was my only purpose." He turned to face her fully, and whatever uncertainty had been in his voice burned away like morning fog in direct sunlight. "But I learned more than building. I learned what courage looks like when it is quiet, what determination looks like when it does not announce itself, what strength looks like when it does not need to prove anything to anyone." He took her hand. His calloused fingers were warm against hers. "I love you, Alara Halverson. I have loved you since the first day I walked into your cave house and felt the warmth, not just from the fire, though that was remarkable enough. The warmth of who you are." Ilara looked at this man who had worked beside her through everything, who had ridden through the night to find a doctor when her sister lay broken on the cave floor, who had never once tried to make himself larger by making her smaller, who had loved her strength instead of being threatened by it. She thought about her mother, who had loved her father despite his flaws and failures, loved him through winters that tested everything, loved him even when his pride was building the walls that would eventually kill her. She thought about her grandmother, who had crossed an ocean for the chance at something better, carrying nothing but courage and the willingness to start over in a place where she knew no one, and no one knew her. She thought about all the women who had come before her, women who had loved and worked and survived against odds that should have been impossible, and who had done it anyway because the alternative was to stop living. And stopping was something none of them had ever learned how to do. "I love you too," she said. His face transformed, the worry and the nervousness falling away like snow sliding off a warm roof, revealing something underneath that was pure and uncomplicated and young in a way that the rest of his storm-hardened face had forgotten how to be. "Does that mean you will marry me?" "Ask me properly." He dropped to one knee in the wildflower meadow, the mountain peaks rising behind him, the afternoon sun turning everything gold. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden ring, carved by his own hands, etched with patterns he had copied from the journal. Old Leif's patterns, the patterns of a tradition that stretched back further than anyone could remember. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Will you let me spend the rest of my life building things with you?" "Yes," she said, and pulled him to his feet. The wedding was small, held at the entrance to the cave house on an afternoon when the aspen trees had turned gold and the air carried the first clean bite of approaching winter. Seren stood beside her sister, walking without a crutch now, her limp barely visible. Dagny stood as witness. Tobrin's mother, finally healthy after months in the cave house her son had built for her, wept with joy throughout the ceremony.
Reverend Harlan performed the service. Ilara had asked him specifically, and the request had surprised everyone, including the minister himself. But she had her reasons. She wanted the man who had once preached against her to speak the words that joined her life to another, not as punishment, but as proof that people could change, that the same voice that had condemned could also bless, that redemption was possible even for those who had earned none.
His voice was humble now, stripped of the certainty that had once made his sermons sound less like guidance and more like verdicts. He spoke of partnership, of two people building something together that neither could build alone. And when he pronounced them married, a sound rose from the gathered crowd that echoed off the mountain peaks. Not quite a cheer, not quite applause, but something warmer and more complicated than either. The sound of a community acknowledging that it had been wrong, and that being wrong had not destroyed it. Stormer died in the spring. He passed the way old animals pass when they have lived fully and held nothing back, quietly, without drama, in his accustomed spot beside the fire. Ilara found him in the early morning, lying on his side, with his eyes closed and his grizzled muzzle resting on his paws, as if he had simply decided that this particular sleep would be his last, and had seen no reason to make a fuss about it. She sat beside him for a long time before she told anyone. She placed her hand on his silver fur, still warm from the fire that had burned through the night, and she remembered the day he had walked through the open door into the snow without waiting for permission, certain that wherever she was going, he was going too. She remembered the way he had led her up the mountain to the cave, his old legs finding trails that only he remembered. She remembered the night he had crossed a crowded room full of frightened strangers to lie down beside a silent little girl and give her a reason to speak again. 12 years, 12 winters, one faithful heart that never wavered. They buried him behind the cave house, beneath a pine tree that Ilara planted to mark the spot. The marker she carved herself. Stormer, faithful friend. He kept us warm when the world outside was cold. Saren went on to design homes throughout the mountain valleys, adapting her grandfather's principles to dozens of different sites and circumstances, developing variations that worked in narrow ravines and broad hillsides, and exposed ridgelines where the wind never stopped. She became the first woman in the region recognized as an architect, not because anyone gave her a certificate or a title, but because the houses she designed stood when others fell, kept their families warm when others froze, and proved through their simple, stubborn existence that she knew what she was doing. She married Thomas Harlan, the minister's eldest son, who had sheltered in the cave house as a boy during the storm. They had children who grew up learning the old ways as naturally as they learned to walk. Children who understood that a wall could be made of stone or wood or earth, and that the best walls were the ones that worked with the mountain instead of pretending the mountain was not there. Years passed. Many years. The kind of years that blur together when they are filled with work and purpose and the steady accumulation of small satisfactions. A wall completed, a student graduated, a winter survived, a grandchild born. And then, on an afternoon when the light was golden and the wildflowers were blooming in the meadow above the cave house, a visitor came.
She was a journalist from the city, writing about unusual homes in the mountain regions. Houses built into hillsides, dwellings that seemed to grow from the rock itself. She had heard stories about a woman who had started it all, and she had come to find her. Ilara was old now. Her hair had gone completely gray. Her face was lined by decades of mountain weather. But her eyes remained sharp and clear, and her hands were still steady. The hands of a woman who had never stopped building. She welcomed the journalist into the cave house. The same house, the same walls, the same fireplace, still drawing perfectly, still warming the stone that radiated heat through the coldest nights. The journal hung in a frame above the mantel, old Leif's drawings preserved behind glass. The ink faded, but the lines still precise, still readable, still teaching anyone who took the time to look. "What gave you the strength to keep going?" the journalist asked. "When everyone said you were wrong, what made you persist?" Ilara was quiet for a long time. She looked at the framed drawings, at the fire burning in the hearth her grandfather had designed and she had built with her own hands, at the stone walls that had held through every storm the mountain had produced in all the years since she first pressed her palm against them and felt their constant warmth. "I was never alone," she said finally, "even when I felt completely isolated. I had my grandfather's knowledge. I had my sister's belief in what we were doing. I had people who came to learn instead of to mock." She paused. "The people who laugh at you are not your enemies. They are simply people who cannot yet see what you see. Your job is not to convince them with words. Your job is to build. Build what you believe in. Build it carefully. Build it well. And when it is finished, when it stands strong while everything else fails, they will finally see." The journalist wrote every word down. The article appeared the following month. The response was immediate. Letters from across the region, from people who wanted to learn, who wanted to visit, who wanted to understand how knowledge from another century and another continent could still matter. Ilara answered every letter. She taught until her hands grew too stiff to demonstrate. She traveled to building sites throughout the mountains, advising and correcting and encouraging. She trained builders who would train the next generation, who would train the generation after that. An unbroken chain of knowledge stretching forward from old Leif's careful drawings into a future he had imagined but would never see. The cave house still stands. It has been maintained by the family for generations now, each one making repairs and improvements while preserving the essential design that old Leif created. The stone fireplace still radiates heat through the coldest nights. The wooden walls still keep out the wind. The cave itself still holds its constant temperature, exactly as it did when a grieving 19-year-old girl first stepped inside and pressed her palm against the stone and felt something that was not quite warmth, but was the opposite of cold. The steady, patient, unchanging temperature of a mountain that had been waiting for someone who would listen to what it had to say. The mountain does not care who laughs.
The mountain does not care who doubts, or mocks, or threatens, or predicts failure with the smug confidence of people who have never tried to build anything themselves. The mountain only cares who survives. And if you build with wisdom, if you build with patience, if you build with the knowledge that was earned by everyone who struggled and learned before you, you will survive. You will more than survive. You will build something that outlasts the storms, something that outlasts the laughter, something that outlasts even you and stands waiting, warm and steady, for the next person who needs it. The mountain does not forget, and neither will you.